Karen didn't clock, she stormed. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like she was auditioning for a bad cop show. She marched right onto my dock and barked that I had 30 days to sell my cabin, or the HOA would make life impossible. Her words weren't just loud. They were meant to humiliate, pitched so every neighbor trimming their hedges or sipping their morning coffee could hear. A few even stopped to stare, whispering like I was some outlaw squatting on land that had been mine since childhood. I didn't argue. I didn't even set down my mug. Because here's the part. Karen didn't know the bank that held her mortgage, the roof over her head, the little suburban castle she bragged about at every HOA meeting. That bank was me. Or more precisely, I was the man behind the desk who signed off on whether her home stayed hers. So while she rattled on about bylaws and fines, I just smiled. "Careful, Karen," I murmured low enough that only she and the lake breeze could hear. "You might want to check who really owns your house before you try to take mine." Her smirk faltered, but just for a moment. And that was the moment I knew this fight wasn't going to end the way she thought. My name is Jack Marshall. I'm 52 years old, a man who's worn enough ties and sat through enough boardroom meetings to know the weight of silence is often louder than shouting. By trade, I'm a banker regional director, to be exact. That means numbers, mortgages, and signatures have been my daily bread for decades. But before all that, before the polished shoes and glass offices, there was this lake, this cabin. My grandfather built it in the late 40s with his own hands, every beam smelling of sweat and cedar. Summers here were my childhood barefoot mornings, fishing off the dock campfires, crackling under skies so dark the stars looked close enough to pluck. When life in the city started suffocating me with traffic jams and fluorescent lights, I came back. I bought the old cabin out of the family estate, fixed up the roof, patched the screen doors, and told myself I wasn't just preserving history. I was reclaiming my sanity. The lake community itself is something out of a postcard. Pines framing the shoreline docks, jutting like little fingers, the water mirroring a sky that could turn from sapphire to silver in a single breath. Neighbors here come in two kinds, the old-timers like me who see the lake as a birthright, and the weekend warriors with shiny boats and shinier attitudes. Most of us get along fine. We wave, we help each other haul wood, we pass sugar and coffee filters like currency, and then there's the HOA. When I first moved back, I thought the Homeowners Association was just a loose formality, a group that handled snow plowing in winter and trash pickup in summer. But in truth, it was a fiefdom. And at its throne sat Karen Whitmore, mid-40s blonde highlights, as sharp as her tongue, armed with a wardrobe of blazers so bold they looked like warning sirens. Karen wasn't elected. She was enthroned by sheer intimidation. The board members nodded when she spoke. Neighbors cringed when she marched by. And anyone who questioned her found themselves buried under paperwork and fines that seemed to appear out of thin air. I wasn't impressed. Not because I wanted trouble. Lord knows at this age I'd rather sip bourbon on the deck than argue over mailbox heights, but because I've dealt with bigger egos than hers. When you spend 30 years in banking, you meet men who think money buys the air other people breathe. Compared to them, Karen was just a loud echo in a quiet valley. Still, I knew better than to dismiss her completely. Bullies thrive when no one pushes back. She'd find neighbors for non-regulation curtains. She'd ordered one family to repaint their cottage because the shade of yellow was too cheerful. I once watched her call the sheriff because a teenager left a kayak on the grass overnight. Folks grumbled, but nobody fought. That's how Karen stayed queen. For me, the cabin was more than lumber and paint. It was the one place where I felt human again. My late wife used to tease that I was more myself with a hammer in hand than a pen. After she passed, the lake became refuge, not just retreat. Sitting on that deck with the morning mist curling over the water, I could almost hear her laugh again. That's something you can't put a price tag on. That's something no HOA form can regulate. So when Karen came after me after my cabin, she wasn't just messing with bylaws, she was stepping onto sacred ground. But here's the delicious irony. While she strutted around barking orders about property standards and community integrity, she had no idea the very roof over her head existed because of people like me. Every month, her payment slipped through my bank system. Every late fee she tried to bury, I could see it with one click. I didn't flaunt it, didn't boast. Because power, real power, works best when it's quiet. At first I thought maybe Karen would leave me be. Maybe she'd sense I wasn't like the others, easily cowed, easily cornered. But that first week, she made it clear she saw me as an intruder, a man who had dared to hold on to something she couldn't control. And control was her favorite drug. I sipped my coffee on the deck that morning, the sun cutting diamonds across the water, and told myself, don't start a fight unless you're ready to finish it. I didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to teach me just how far she was willing to go. And I was about to remind her just how dangerous it is to underestimate a man who knows both land and ledgers. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The first shot in this war wasn't a scream or a knock on my door, or even the screech of Karen's SUV brakes at the end of my driveway. It was a folded piece of paper tucked neatly under my cabin door like some neighborly note. I almost ignored it. After all, half the junk that ends up on my porch are pizza coupons and advertisements for lawn service I'll never hire. But this one had weight to it. The paper was thicker officious, stamped with the HOA crest, like it had been blessed by some higher authority. I set down my coffee and unfolded it right there at the threshold. Violation. Notice it read in bold, blocky letters that screamed self-importance. My alleged crime. My dock extended 2 feet longer than the approved length per HOA regulations. The fine $500 if not corrected within 10 days. I laughed. I couldn't help myself. That dock had been here since I was a boy, long before Karen ever marched in with her clipboard and oversized sunglasses. My grandfather built it, my father rebuilt it, and I had restored it when I returned. It was more than wood and nails, it was memory. That dock had carried fishing poles, fireworks, first kisses and ashes scattered into the water. To call it a violation was like calling the lake too wet. I tucked the notice in my back pocket, planning to crumple it and light the evening fire with it. But Karen never relied on paper alone. 2 mornings later, I was raking pine needles when I heard the unmistakable clip of heels on wood. Karen marched straight down my driveway past the private property sign, as if she owned the land under her shoes. She was dressed like she was running for office. Bright blazer hair sprayed into submission lips, pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Marshall," she began, her voice high-pitched and theatrical, "you've been served notice. Your dock is non-compliant." She pulled another sheet from her folder, holding it like a weapon. I leaned on my rake and smiled. "Karen, that dock has been here since before your HOA existed." "That may be," she snapped, eyes flashing. "But rules are rules. Standards matter. If you want to live here, you need to play by them. If not, perhaps you should consider selling to someone who will." There it was, the real motive. She didn't want my dock shorter. She wanted me gone. I should have felt angry, but mostly I felt amused. Here was this woman strutting on ground my grandfather cleared, dictating what my family's history should look like. She thought she had me cornered with her little fines and bylaws. She had no idea who she was dealing with. That week, the papers kept coming. First the dock, then the shutters on my cabin too dark, she claimed, not in harmony with the community aesthetic. Next, the mailbox by the gravel road, apparently unapproved design, though it had been standing there since the 1962nd. Then the firewood stacked by the cabin wall, unsightly storage, another $250 penalty if not corrected. It was harassment dressed up in bureaucracy. At the general store, I began to notice the whispers. A couple at the counter muttered, "That new guy's already in trouble with Karen." On the trail, an older neighbor, a man named Frank, warned me, "Watch yourself." She did the same thing to the Millers. Fined them until they couldn't keep up. Packed up and left last year. "She can't make me leave," I said, half joking. Frank gave me a look. "That's what they said too." I brushed it off. But when I came home later that week and found 2 sheriff's deputies standing at the edge of my dock, I realized Karen had turned the volume up. "Mr. Marshall," one of them called, "we got a complaint. Something about your dock being unsafe for children in the community." I joined them at the water's edge, where the boards gleamed smooth under the sun, sturdy as ever. "Unsafe?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. They exchanged, looks clearly embarrassed. "We don't see an issue, just had to check it out." I thanked them, and they left shaking their heads, but the damage was done. Half the lakeside had seen flashing lights by my cabin sirens bouncing across the water like I was running moonshine instead of frying bacon that morning. That night I sat on the deck with a glass of bourbon and thought about what Frank said. Karen wasn't testing me. She was declaring war. And she had already recruited the county to play along. I told myself I didn't want trouble. At my age, I'd earned the right to peace. But peace doesn't come from letting someone like Karen win. Bullies grow when fed silence. If I ignored her, she'd just find another reason: grass too long, chimney too short, wind chimes too loud. And if she managed to drive me off, she'd grow bolder with everyone else. That's when the first crackle of anger sparked in me. Not a wildfire, not yet, but a steady ember. The kind you tuck into kindling and know sooner or later it'll blaze. Karen thought I was just another homeowner, another weak link she could bully into submission. She thought she held the power. What she didn't realize, not yet, was that I knew power better than anyone. My whole career was built on it. Not the loud screaming kind, the quiet kind. The kind that arrives in envelopes thicker than any HOA notice, with signatures that decide who keeps a roof and who loses one. So when she left her next notice, this one demanding I voluntarily consider selling to a more suitable community member, I didn't tear it up. I placed it neatly in a folder labeled Evidence, because I'd just decided if Karen wanted war, I was going to give her one. And she had no idea that I was already holding the one weapon she couldn't outvote, outfine, or outshout. The notices didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied like weeds. Every few days, I'd find another envelope tucked under my door, slid between the cabin shutters, or even taped to my mailbox like a scarlet letter. Each one was stamped with the HOA crest Karen's crown, and each carried a new accusation. It became routine wake up, brew coffee, step outside, and collect my daily harassment. One morning it was the dock again, apparently still unsafe. The next it was my deck furniture, which Karen claimed was non-uniform and disruptive to community cohesion. Another week she cited me for the excessive presence of firewood stacked along the side of my cabin. I wanted to ask her if she expected me to burn pine needles instead of logs in the middle of a Michigan winter, but sarcasm wouldn't get me far with a woman whose ego was taller than her hair. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting just to see how deep the madness went. It was held in the community clubhouse, a log cabin-style building that looked friendly enough on the outside but buzzed with tension inside. Folding chairs lined up in rows, neighbors muttering among themselves, the smell of burnt coffee wafting from a styrofoam pot. Karen stood at the front like a queen in her castle, clipboard in hand, a slideshow of bylaws projected on the wall behind her. Her board members, three tired-looking people who might as well have been mannequins, nodded obediently at everything she said. When it came time for violations, Karen's eyes sparkled like she'd been waiting all week for this moment. She read my name slowly, savoring it, then listed off my so-called offenses: dock, too long mailbox, not compliant shutters, the wrong color firewood, unsightly, and this one nearly made me spit my coffee, unapproved use of property. I raised my hand. Care to explain that last one? Karen gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, Mr. Marshall, we've noticed frequent gatherings at your cabin. Visitors, multiple cars in your driveway. That can disrupt community harmony. I laughed out loud, the sound bouncing across the room. Karen, those gatherings you're talking about, that was me helping my nephew move in a couch. Unless you think a U-Haul is a threat to the community. A few neighbors chuckled, but Karen's glare silenced them quickly. This is no laughing matter, she snapped. Rules are rules. That phrase, rules are rules, became her mantra. She wielded it like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared to resist. But I noticed something else that night. The neighbors were tired. Their shoulders sagged. Their eyes rolled when she wasn't looking. A few avoided my gaze altogether, as if afraid to be seen sympathizing with me. Karen's rule was absolute, and fear was her currency. Still, she wasn't finished with me. The next escalation came in the form of a letter delivered not by Karen, but by the county. It cited me for improper waste disposal. Apparently, according to Karen's complaint, I'd been burning prohibited materials in my fire pit. I hadn't burned anything but wood, but the county still sent a representative to investigate. By then, I'd stopped being shocked. Karen had found a new weapon, outsourcing her crusade to anyone who would listen. If she couldn't bury me under HOA bylaws, she'd drag in local authorities. One evening, as I was repairing a loose plank on my porch, Karen appeared again. This time, she didn't bother with fake smiles. She marched up heels, clicking arms crossed. "You're becoming a problem, Mr. Marshall," she said flatly. "This community thrives on order, and you clearly don't respect that." I set down my hammer and met her gaze. "Karen, I respect rules. What I don't respect is abuse of them." Her lips tightened. "You'll find that abuse is a matter of perspective. If you don't want to live under this association's standards, maybe it's time to think about selling. Voluntarily. It'll save everyone a lot of trouble." That word again, voluntarily. It dripped with threat. I didn't answer her. Not directly. But in my silence, she saw what she thought was weakness. She smirked, pivoted on her heel, and walked away like she'd just won a battle. But she hadn't won anything. Not yet. The escalation kept climbing. She fined me for leaving tools visible on my deck. She sent me a formal warning about improper landscaping because the wildflowers near my cabin didn't match the HOA's preferred species. She even threatened to suspend my lake access privileges, which was hilarious, considering my cabin sat directly on the water. What struck me most wasn't the absurdity, it was her obsession. She was no longer just enforcing rules. She was fixated on me, like driving me out had become her personal mission. And the more she pushed, the more I realized something dangerous. She needed me gone. Badly. I couldn't figure out why yet. But I knew one thing for sure: Karen wasn't just picking a fight. She was building to something bigger. That night, I sat on my deck watching the moonlight shimmer across the lake. The air was cool, the loons called, and yet my chest burned with frustration. She'd dragged the county into it. She'd humiliated me in public meetings. She'd plastered me with fines so ridiculous they'd be funny if they weren't adding up in real dollars. For the first time, I admitted it out loud: she wants me out. And when I said it, something shifted. Because once you recognize the game, you can start planning your own moves. Karen thought she had me cornered with fines, bylaws, and threats. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the man she was trying to bully was the very man who signed off on her mortgage. She thought she was building pressure. In truth, she was tightening the noose around her own neck. The night after that HOA meeting, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the rafters, listening to the wind move through the pines. Karen's smug face replayed in my mind, her words sharp as nails. Maybe it's time to think about selling. Voluntarily. She had said it so casually, as if she were doing me a favor. I rolled over and thought, why? Why was she so obsessed with my cabin? Sure, she was a control freak, but this felt bigger. It wasn't just about rules or power anymore. She was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. So I did what I've always done when things don't add up. I went to the numbers. The next morning, I drove into town to the branch of the bank where I'd built my career. Even though I'd taken a step back into more regional oversight, I still had access to the tools. A few keystrokes, a few logins, and suddenly, the truth of Karen Whitmore's life unfolded in front of me on a glowing computer screen. And oh, what a truth it was. Her mortgage was held by my bank. Not only that, she was behind. Not by much, just a couple of months, but in finance, lateness is blood in the water. And Karen had been bleeding for a while. The system showed late fees piling up, penalty notices, mailed warnings ignored. She wasn't the queen she pretended to be. She was a debtor balancing on stilts, and the ground was starting to shake. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, low whistle. So that's why you want me gone. But it didn't stop there. Curiosity carried me further. I checked HOA accounts, the association's ledgers. Thanks to my contacts and my understanding of financial disclosures, I saw things the average homeowner would never know. The numbers were messy. Funds shifted around in ways that smelled rotten. Community fees collected but unaccounted for. Payments delayed. Maintenance budgets suspiciously low while administrative costs soared. It painted a picture I'd seen before in small-town politics. Mismanagement at best, embezzlement at worst. Karen wasn't protecting the community. She was covering her own cracks. And my resistance threatened to expose her. If I didn't sell my cabin, her scheme stayed under the microscope. And if neighbors started looking too closely, well, her little empire could crumble. The realization lit something in me. All those notices, all those petty fines, all those humiliations, suddenly they weren't just bullying. They were panic. She needed me out of the way to keep her world from collapsing. That night, I started my own little war chest. I pulled out a binder and labeled it simply Karen. Into it went every notice. She'd sent me every letter, every fine. I recorded the date, the absurd charge, the dollar amount. I stapled receipts from trips to the store where neighbors whispered warnings. I printed screenshots of the county citation she'd filed against me. Evidence. Layer upon layer of evidence. But I didn't stop there. I invested in a small recorder, the kind you could slip into a pocket. At the next HOA meeting, I kept it running. Karen ranted about community values and standards of excellence, her voice growing shrill as she waved papers around like weapons. Each word went into my archive. Every threat, every manipulation, every slip. Neighbors began to notice my calm. When Karen cornered me in public, trying to humiliate me, I simply smiled and said, "I hear you, Karen. I'll make a note of that." They didn't know why I was so serene, but it unnerved her. She thrived on reactions, and my lack of one made her claws dig deeper. One evening, as the sun melted into the lake, my neighbor Linda stopped by with a pie. She was in her 60s, gentle but sharp, the kind of woman who always noticed more than she let on. "Jack," she said softly, "don't let her drive you off. You're not the first she's tried this on, but maybe you can be the last." "Why me?" I asked, though I already knew part of the answer. Linda sighed. "Because you don't bend. The Millers bent. The Harrisons bent. Everyone bends eventually. But you," she looked me dead in the eyes, "you've got steel in your spine. And she knows it." That night after Linda left, I sat at the dining table flipping through my binder. Steel in my spine, sure. But now I also had steel in my hand, her mortgage, her late payments, her fragile little financial kingdom. I poured a bourbon and whispered to myself, "You want my cabin, Karen, funny, because I own your house." It wasn't time to play that card yet. Timing mattered. Like poker, the strongest hand means nothing if you show it too early. But knowing I had that ace tucked away gave me patience. Let her escalate. Let her scream and whine and call the cops again. Every move she made tightened the rope around her own neck. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice for me and for everyone she'd steamrolled before me. She had thrived because no one fought back. But this time she'd picked a man who understood both the emotional weight of a family cabin and the cold arithmetic of a balance sheet. And in that combination, Karen was doomed. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since this all started, I didn't feel cornered. I felt ready. The more calm I became, the more desperate Karen grew. My silence didn't rattle me, it rattled her. Bullies thrive on reaction, and when they don't get one, they double their efforts. Soon Karen's little campaign against me turned from harassment into an outright siege. It started with fines so outrageous they read like satire. One morning I opened my mailbox to find a bright pink slip, Karen's idea of urgent correspondence. The charge: improper curtain color. Apparently, the off-white blinds in my living room were too stark against the natural aesthetic of the lake. She demanded I replace them with approved neutral tones within 30 days, or face a $1,000 fine. I nearly choked on my coffee. Curtains. She was fining me over curtains. A few days later came another $750 for dock misuse. According to her, my nephew had been spotted fishing off the edge without wearing a life vest. Never mind that the boy was 16, 6 feet tall, and had been swimming competitively since he was 5. Karen turned it into a criminal offense. Then came the kicker, a $2,500 penalty for unauthorized gatherings. Her evidence, a Saturday barbecue where I'd grilled burgers for 3 neighbors. Apparently 3 lawn chairs and the smell of hickory smoke counted as an unsanctioned festival. I didn't pay a dime. Instead, I slid each notice into my binder, labeling and numbering them like trophies. But Karen wasn't done. She escalated to humiliation tactics. At the next HOA meeting, she printed out copies of my supposed infractions and passed them around like gossip columns. She stood at the front of the room, voice sharp, declaring, "Mr. Marshall is a repeat offender who refuses to uphold our community standards." This kind of behavior drags us all down. Neighbors avoided my eyes, but I saw the flicker of sympathy on a few faces. They'd been there too, fined for nonsense, bullied into compliance. Karen thought she was turning the crowd against me. She didn't realize she was planting seeds of rebellion. Her boldest strike came 2 weeks later. I came home from a supply run in town to find 2 sheriff's cruisers parked at the end of my driveway lights, flashing against the pines. My stomach sank for a moment. What now? The deputy explained that Karen had filed a complaint accusing me of illegal rental activity. She claimed I was secretly renting my cabin on weekends to strangers, turning it into an unlicensed Airbnb. I couldn't help but laugh. "Officer, I've lived here every day since spring. The only strangers I've hosted are my sister and her kids." The deputies were apologetic. They knew the complaint was flimsy, but procedure required them to check. Still, the sight of law enforcement vehicles outside my cabin was enough to raise eyebrows around the lake. Neighbors peeked from windows, whispers carried across the water. That night I sat by the fire binder open on the table, flipping through page after page of her madness. My anger simmered, but beneath it was something colder: resolve. Karen thought she was backing me into a corner, but what she was really doing was building my case. Every letter, every fine, every false complaint, proof. Still, she had one more card to play. The following week, I received a certified letter in the mail. Inside was a formal notice of intent from the HOA board. If I didn't comply with outstanding fines totaling over $10,000, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings against my cabin. I sat there at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands, not from fear but from laughter. They were threatening to take the cabin my grandfather built. My cabin. The one place in the world that was truly mine. And that's when I understood something crucial. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was desperate. Buried under her own debts, hiding mismanaged HOA funds, she needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to make an example of, someone to distract the community while she patched the holes in her own sinking ship, and she thought that someone was me. But she had no idea the man she was trying to crush was the same man who held her mortgage. So I poured myself a bourbon, added the foreclosure notice to my binder, and whispered into the firelight, "All right, Karen, you've had your fun, now it's my turn." Because here's the thing about bankers: we understand patience. We understand leverage. And when the time comes, we know exactly how to pull the rug out from under someone's feet. Karen had just declared war. But what she didn't realize was that I already owned the battlefield. I've always believed that the quiet moments before a storm matter more than the storm itself. It's in those quiet hours, when the lake lies flat as glass, and the only sound is the wind threading through the pines, that real decisions get made. And after Karen tried to slap me with a foreclosure notice, I knew my decision was made. No more waiting. It was time to prepare my counterstrike. I began the way I always do, with paperwork. My binder, once a modest folder, had grown into a brick of documentation. Each fine neatly logged, each false complaint stapled and dated, each absurd letter highlighted for emphasis. Flipping through it was like watching a comedy show spiral into a crime drama. But I knew evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Bullies like Karen don't crumble just because you wave papers in their faces. They crumble when the law, the money, and the people all stand on the same side, and I intended to put them there. First step, legal counsel. I drove into town and sat down with a lawyer named Harris. He was a stout man in his 60s with glasses that always seemed to slide down his nose. I'd known him since my youth, back when he handled my father's estate after the old man passed. He flipped through my binder page by page, shaking his head with every ridiculous violation. "Jack," he said, finally setting the binder down, "this isn't just harassment, this is abuse of power, intimidation, possibly fraud. If half of this is accurate, and I don't doubt it is, you've got a case." "Good," I replied, "because I don't just want to defend myself. I want to make sure she can't do this to anyone else again." Harris leaned back in his chair, eyeing me. "Then you'll need allies. People willing to testify, willing to put their names beside yours." Which led to step 2, neighbors. For years, most of them had kept their heads down, afraid of Karen's wrath. But fear has a funny way of cracking once someone shows the first bit of defiance. I started small, talking to folks individually, usually in casual settings. On a walk at the general store while helping Frank stack his woodpile. "Frank," I said one evening, "you remember when she fined you for leaving your kayak by the water overnight?" He grimaced. "How could I forget? Cost me $300. I pulled out a copy of my binder page and showed him. "I'm putting this together. Not just for me, for all of us. If she's hit you, if she's hit others, I want it on record." Frank hesitated, then nodded. About damn time. Word spread. Slowly, cautiously, neighbors began to share their own stories. Linda confessed that Karen once threatened to revoke her lake privileges because her grandkids had drawn chalk on the driveway. Another family admitted they'd paid thousands in bogus fines just to avoid the stress. Each story fueled my resolve. Karen hadn't just targeted me, she'd been running a small dictatorship for years. Step 3, the bank. Here's where things got delicate. I had access legally to the mortgage accounts under my jurisdiction, and Karen's house was one of them. I pulled her file again, reviewed every late payment, every penalty notice ignored. It was all there in black and white. She was hanging on by threads, juggling debts while pretending to be queen. I didn't act recklessly. I knew the rules, privacy procedure, professionalism. But I also knew this: her arrogance blinded her to the one fact she should have feared most. She was trying to take my cabin while I literally held the deed to her house in my bank system. Step 4, timing. I circled the date of the next HOA general meeting on my calendar. It would be the perfect stage. Neighbors, gathered board members, present Karen in full performance mode. That's when I would strike. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with cold, undeniable truth. In the days leading up to it, I prepared like a man sharpening a blade. Harris drafted legal language for a cease and desist against further harassment. My binder grew heavier with signed statements from neighbors, and I printed Karen's mortgage records, not to humiliate her, not yet, but to remind myself that I had the ace. The last piece of preparation was mental. I walked the shoreline at dusk, rehearsing what I'd say. I pictured Karen's smirk, her finger jabbing the air, her threats echoing across the clubhouse walls. And then I pictured the silence after I spoke the hush, when the truth landed like a hammer. One evening, as the sun burned low and painted the lake in fire, Linda stopped by again. "You look ready," she said, handing me another pie. "I am," I answered. "Karen thinks she's the storm, but she doesn't realize I've weathered bigger ones." Linda smiled, eyes twinkling. "Just promise me one thing, Jack." "What's that?" "Don't just win for yourself, win for all of us." Her words stuck with me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was for every neighbor she'd bullied, every family she'd squeezed, every person who'd felt powerless under her rule. The night before the meeting, I sat on my deck with a bourbon in hand. The air was cool, the stars sharp above me. I opened my binder one last time, flipping through the absurdities fines for curtains, threats over kayaks, even the police reports. Then I looked at the final page, Karen's mortgage statement past due. I smiled, closed the binder, and whispered into the night. Tomorrow, the Queen loses her crown. The night of the HOA meeting felt different from the others. The clubhouse, usually half empty and echoing with Karen's shrill voice, was packed to the rafters. Word had spread that something big was coming. Neighbors who usually avoided conflict showed up, folding chairs squeezed into every corner, the air buzzing with quiet anticipation. I walked in with my binder tucked under one arm. No fanfare, no swagger, just calm. But I could feel eyes on me, hopeful eyes, curious eyes, even nervous ones. People had grown tired of Karen, and they were desperate for someone to stand up to her. Karen, of course, was in rare form. She stood at the front, clad in a fire-red blazer that screamed authority, her clipboard clutched like a scepter. The board members flanked her like obedient soldiers, their faces unreadable. When she saw me enter, her lips curled into a thin, triumphant smile. "Ah, Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie, "so glad you could join us. I hope you've come prepared to address your outstanding violations." Murmurs rippled through the room. I simply nodded, took a seat near the front, and set my binder on the table. The meeting began with routine business budget approvals, landscaping updates, the usual drivel, but everyone knew we were all just waiting for the main event. Finally, Karen cleared her throat and tapped her pen against the clipboard. Now, to our final order of business, the ongoing non-compliance of homeowner Jack Marshall. She practically spit out my name. Despite numerous notices, fines, and warnings, Mr. Marshall continues to flaunt our community standards. The board has voted to pursue foreclosure proceedings unless immediate action is taken. Gasps filled the room. Neighbors glanced at one another wide-eyed. Foreclosure was the nuclear option, a threat everyone whispered about, but few believed would ever be used. I stood slowly, letting the tension build. "Karen," I said evenly, "you've made quite a case. But before you bulldoze history, I think the community deserves to hear mine." She smirked, gesturing with her pen. "By all means, enlighten us." I opened my binder. The first few pages, copies of violation notices, fluttered under my fingers. I held one up. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is what Karen fined me for. Dock 2 feet too long. A dock that's been here since the 1942nd. Laughter bubbled in the back rows. Another page. And here curtains. My off-white blinds were deemed non-compliant. Cost a $1,000 fine. Snickers rippled louder now. I flipped through more, my voice steady, growing sharper. With each absurd example, firewood stacked 2 high gatherings, 2 small tools left in plain view. Each page elicited groans, headshakes, mutters of agreement. The neighbors weren't just listening, they were remembering their own fines, their own humiliations. Karen's smile faltered. "This is irrelevant," she snapped. "You're distracting from the fact." "Not irrelevant," I cut in. "Pattern. This binder is full of patterns, and it's not just me. Linda, care to tell them about your grandkids' chalk drawings?" Linda stood, voice quivering but strong. "Karen fined me $200 because my grandkids drew hopscotch squares on the driveway. Said it defaced community property." Gasps and angry whispers erupted. Another neighbor spoke up. "She fined us for keeping kayaks by the water overnight. And me," someone else added, "for planting sunflowers in my yard. Said they weren't on the approved list." The room was alive now, a tide turning. Karen banged her clipboard against the table. "Order, this is slander, Not slander," I said firmly. "Evidence." I turned to the final section of my binder. My voice dropped, calm but cutting. "Karen, you've been threatening me with foreclosure. But perhaps the community should know something about your own house." Her face drained of color. "That's private, not when you use your position to abuse power," I said. "See, I happen to know that the bank holding your mortgage is my bank. And according to the records," I held up the paper, "crisp and undeniable, you're months behind on your payments." A collective gasp shook the room. Neighbors leaned forward, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen's hands trembled, clutching her clipboard like a shield. That's none of your business. It becomes everyone's business when the woman threatening to take my cabin can't even keep her own house afloat," I shot back. "You preach about community standards while you drown in your own debt. You fine us for curtains and chalk drawings while mismanaging HOA funds. You've bullied good people into silence. But tonight that silence ends." I slammed the binder shut. "You wanted my cabin, Karen. Here's the truth. I own the roof over your head. You don't hold power here. Not anymore." The room erupted, cheers, claps, shouts of agreement. Neighbors who had cowered under her reign were suddenly emboldened, voices rising together. Karen stammered her red blazer. now more a scarlet letter. She tried to speak, but the noise swallowed her. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the tide had turned. Finally, one of them, a thin man named Collins, stood and cleared his throat. Given this new information, I moved to suspend all actions against Mr. Marshall. Effective immediately. Hands shot up in agreement. The vote passed before Karen could even regain her footing. She stood frozen, pale, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. For once, she had no words. I gathered my binder, nodded to the room, and said quietly, "Meeting adjourned." As I walked out, neighbors patted my back, murmuring thanks, their relief palpable. Behind me, Karen sat in silence, her crown shattered, her empire collapsing. And for the first time in a long while, the lake felt free. The night after that meeting, the lake was quieter than it had been in months. No more whispers about who Karen was targeting next. No more nervous glances at HOA notices taped to mailboxes. Just the wind in the trees, the ripple of water against docks, and a freedom that felt almost foreign. Word traveled fast. By sunrise, nearly every homeowner on the lake knew what had happened. People who had avoided me before, wary of being associated with the troublemaker, now waved when I walked by. Some stopped me outright. Jack Frank said, shaking my hand firmly, "You don't know how long we've waited for someone to stand up to her." Linda hugged me with tears in her eyes. "My grandkids can draw in chalk again," she laughed, half joking but also dead serious. The relief in their voices was heavier than I'd expected. It wasn't just me. Karen had been bullying, it was everyone. And for years, they'd all lived under her thumb, too afraid to speak up. When I exposed her, I hadn't just won my battle. I'd freed an entire community. Karen, on the other hand, disappeared. The red blazer didn't make an appearance at the next meeting. In fact, she resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. Rumors swirled about her financial troubles, but nobody pressed her for details. Maybe they felt pity. Maybe they just wanted her gone. I didn't celebrate her downfall. Revenge wasn't the flavor of my victory, it was relief. Relief that the cabin my grandfather built would stay in the family. Relief that neighbors no longer had to live in fear of a woman with a clipboard and a taste for power. But Karen's collapse had ripple effects. An independent audit of the HOA revealed a mess funds missing, invoices unpaid, maintenance neglected. For years, she'd been siphoning money into administrative costs that were little more than personal luxuries. The board, humiliated and desperate to regain trust, voted to dissolve her policies and restructure the association. For the first time, actual transparency entered the picture. I stayed involved not because I wanted power, but because I wanted fairness. I wasn't about to let another Karen slip into that chair unchallenged. When neighbors nominated me to join the board, I accepted not to dictate, but to protect. Life at the lake settled back into its old rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the deck, afternoons helping neighbors with repairs, evenings listening to loons call across the water. For the first time since I moved back, I felt peace return. One evening, I sat with Frank and Linda by a bonfire, the flames licking the night sky. Frank leaned back and said, "You know, Jack, you didn't just save your cabin, you saved all of ours." I poked at the fire with a stick and shrugged. I didn't save anything. I just reminded her who she was dealing with. She thought she had all the power because she had the clipboard, the bylaws, the fines. But real power, quiet power, is knowing when to hold your ground and when to remind people of the truth. Linda smiled softly. "Still, you taught us something. You showed us that even bullies with crowns can bleed when someone pushes back." Her words stayed with me. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about Karen. It was about all the Karens out there, the people who thrive on fear, who inflate their importance by pushing others down. The kind of people who convince you they hold the keys to your future when in reality their whole world rests on shaky foundations. I looked at the fire sparks rising into the night and thought of my late wife. She used to say, "Don't let small people make you smaller. Make them rise or walk away." For years this lake had been shrinking under Karen's weight. Now finally it was breathing again. The next morning I walked down to the dock. The boards creaked the same way they always had, steady and familiar. I sat at the edge, feet dangling above the water, coffee in hand. The mist curled across the surface, and for the first time in months I didn't feel the tension in my chest. This was home. Always had been. Always would be. Karen had wanted my cabin gone. Instead she lost her house, her title, her grip. And me, I gained something more valuable than revenge. I gained a community that stood together, finally unafraid. If this story teaches anything, it's that bullies only win when good people stay silent. Power isn't always loud. It isn't in the fines, the threats, or the flashing lights. Real power is quiet. It's the patience to gather truth, the courage to hold your ground, and the wisdom to strike only when the moment is right. Karen thought she was untouchable, but she forgot one simple truth: nobody stands taller by standing on others. So if you've ever dealt with a Karen in your own life, someone who abuses authority, someone who thrives on intimidation, remember this: you don't have to shout to win. You just have to be steady, patient, and unafraid of the truth. Because the truth once revealed is stronger than any clipboard or bylaw. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever stood up to a bully in your community? What happened when you finally pushed back? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to subscribe for more HOA dramas. Revenge tales and justice served ice cold.